Okay, this is part two of cyber security effectiveness. I'm here with Trey, and we are going to go straight in to where we left off last time, which was the ramping of tech debt, the way in which things are recorded and decisions are made. 20% of our risk, what is it representing in that kind of 80-20 rule? Do we want to create friction? And this uniquely started leading into compliance, Trey. I love what you said to me once, which was, compliance, a fast way not to be secure. And what an interesting thought that is. Let's go straight in. Tell me, what are you thinking around this area?
I think I'm in line with pretty much what 90% of any security professional is thinking about roundabouts now in terms of compliance. It is not the way to be secure. In fact, it's the fastest way not to be secure. In the grand scheme of things, compliance is a tick box exercise. It's a binary yes or no, have you or have you not. But that does not tell you if you are secure. So there is a lot more you must do off of the back of compliance in order to secure your environment. What compliance does do, and it is fantastic for this thing, is it gives you insights into areas in which you are failing, or areas in which you may be failing. Mm-hmm. And it's that insight that makes it an incredibly valuable process to go through.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So let's explore that. Because I might answer my question I've just jotted down on my pad here, Trey, which is, why are we getting lost in compliance? Why is this becoming overwhelming for us, and thus we are not being secure because of compliance? And is it the fact that, for whatever reason, the new SEC rules, whatever the compliance framework is, are we being strong-armed into something so strongly that it's pulling us away from our objective of actually being secure and the intent of what this is here for in the first place?
I don't, let me see if I understand the question correctly. We're getting a lot of sort of calls for compliance left, right, and center. And is this pulling us away from where we really need to focus? Is that kind of accurate? Yes, we are getting a lot of calls for compliance. And that's primarily because of, I think anyway, it's primarily because of the way we now do business. Companies today don't work in one single place. They're working internationally. They're working in multiple jurisdictions. So all of a sudden, you have a product offering that's being created in country X, that's being offered in country Y, Z, A, B, D. All of a sudden, you have a whole bunch of different regulatory requirements that you may need to abide by. Mm-hmm. At the same time, in your home country, you may have, your business may have different industry verticals that it's actually working in, and you have compliance requirements from those industry verticals. But despite the number of businesses and the number of countries you go into, you're not necessarily having more employees to deal with the overall compliance requirements. So we start scrambling to try and figure out, how do we harmonize this? That's a brilliant way to go about it. How do we posture ourselves so that it's very simple and easy, and in many ways, automatic for us to respond to compliance requests? So that's one approach.
I love that word, harmonize. I've not heard anyone ever say that before in context of compliance. Tell me more.
So how do we harmonize? That's one. But then also I would say the sort of knee-jerk reaction, which I guess many of us, if we've worked in industry for long enough, the knee-jerk reaction is, let's just do this as fast as we possibly can, right? And it just becomes that simple tick box exercise, and we don't take the time to review what the compliance exercise is telling us. We need to be compliant because the business environment in which we are in requires us to do a certain thing, to act a certain way, to exhibit a certain posture. And we are in the business of enabling business. So we must always remember that when all of these things come flying through and coming to hit us. So we have to work smarter, not necessarily harder. And I believe being able to harmonize compliance requirements is a superb way of dealing with, all of these compliance calls from all the various industries and the various countries and various regulators that your business may be dealing with.
I hear you, Trey, because if you take, for example, 27001, there are many ways, as everyone knows, of approaching this. You can view it as a huge gate and milestone to get through. And as we see, what does the auditor first do? Documentation review. Are your references, linking to each other? I mean, what a way to pull it down to sort of, the non-usable end of things where people don't believe in the spirit of it. I am a little tongue-in-cheek by saying that, but that's the first thing it's audited on audit number one. Whereas if you use 27001 in its true form, it's an enabler for risk decisions and making sure the cadence, the journey, and everything else is there. And interestingly, the way we've applied it here, we're in many time zones. We are in 8 countries, and we have, goodness knows us, how many issues in relation to compliance, data, residency, transfer, everything like that. And our solution was to use 27001 to risk manage that and to do something interesting. Our solution was very simple. 1, find out, establish, and understand all of those compliance and governance frameworks that apply to us. Baseline, the law. Now, let's look at our commercial obligations, the business of doing business as you say, and make sure what are our obligations within them. Do they match? How do they intersect? And so on and so forth. And then the next stage, which is a really interesting way of rationalizing this, and this came from our exec internally, which was how can we do it better? And thus, how do we also encode it to be simple, whereby that's the next level of abstraction and is better and takes care of everything else by default. And that's how we applied our risk thinking, to your point, to make it simple. So then we're not overloaded. Your thoughts? How do we take that forward? Is it applicable?
I think it's 100% applicable, even more so in organizations who are cloud first. Okay.
Yes.
Because you can automate a lot of this stuff. For those who are not necessarily cloud first, for legacy technology infrastructure, things may not be so simple. And it really depends on what technology stack you have implemented. But as we move to the cloud, as companies increasingly move to the cloud, I should say, the ability to automate a lot of this stuff is possible. You can set your infrastructure up such that it is already, compliant with whatever framework you need it to comply with. Now, will your business run on that level of compliance? That's something that remains to be seen. But these are things that can be done, right? These are things that can be done. And a good cybersecurity leader is one where they can take those compliance requirements, marry up the business requirements, as you mentioned, and then come up with a list of controls that enable them to do business, but at the same time enable them to easily comply with whichever regulations they need to comply to.
So you've worked in the US, though. Now, if we take that one country, many states, different applicability of state law to federal/environmental related to compliance. How do we navigate that within the states alone?
That's a very interesting question, because all of a sudden you have another layer to what your compliance requirements are likely to be. But then again, this is why we have risk management. I haven't actually come across a situation where state law is in direct opposition to federal law. I haven't come across that. But if that actually does exist anywhere, it suddenly becomes a risk decision, right? It becomes a business decision. But again, with all of these things, they are business decisions because there are always impacts to not complying with the regulation that has been set out.
There's always a common basis, though, of most things, as you say, they don't necessarily conflict, but they may be overlapping. So there's areas of huge swathe of commonality plus then deltas.
Yes, correct.
But there's your compliance
challenge. Those are the outliers, right? So focus that, again, the 80-20, right? As cybersecurity professionals, we need to make sure the business can do what it needs to do. It needs to be able to do it quickly. In many cases, it needs to do it simpler, better, and cheaper, right? And we need to enable those things. And where they overlap, we take advantage of the overlapping, which means one, that's less work for us to do. But first, we have to do the work up front to identify those areas where they overlap. And then we treat the outliers separately. right? And they're outliers at the end of the day, but we must address outliers, because outliers have a horrible way of becoming the black swan in your environment, and then all of a sudden all hell breaks loose because this one thing that was unlikely to ever happen suddenly just conspired, and a few things conspire together, and then it happens.
Yeah, it's the foundation of a whole bunch of further decisions you made with that dependency right at the root.
Yes, indeed.
Interesting
indeed.
that. You were talking also about how do we join it all up together? So in the next sort of 5 or 6 minutes, tell me, we were talking, we've got so many areas, compliance, a fast way not to be secure, but can work in both ways. How do we join this up with our offensive posture, our defensive posture, our compliance posture, and all of these complexities, Trey? So take me down that journey for the next 5 minutes. What do we do about this?
Ooh.
Practical steps.
That sounds to me that we're talking about, our overall effectiveness. How do we know how well we're doing a thing? And in general, when we were in school, we'd get this report card, right? And the report card would say, okay, you did great in math, you did great in English, you did great in this, you're not so good in that, right? Similarly, when we go off to universities, we get a grade at the end of it that says, well, you got a 2-1 in this, you got a 1-1 here, distinction, whatever the case may be. You get a report card, right? And in our industry, report cards are there are 1,000,001 of them, right? They're generally called metrics. So cybersecurity metrics and reporting is a key aspect to understanding how well or how effective your cybersecurity organization may actually be. So when we start talking about compliance, that can be a metric in itself. When we start talking about operational security, that can be a metric in itself. When we start talking about application security, that could be a metric in itself. I say all of this just to reiterate the point that there is not one single metric that is going to tell you how well you are doing a thing. There are multiple different metrics. And I guess if you're, as a cybersecurity leader, your objective really is to steer this ship and ensure that the board understand how well you're spending their money. And your job suddenly becomes one where I fundamentally believe anyway, where you're going to have to translate these metrics into something that they understand. I don't believe you can dumb it down so much to have a single metric, but I believe that you can take your time in that position to also educate your board members such that they understand these metrics themselves, so that they can dig deeper and ask the right types of questions in order to challenge and ensure that the business is where it needs to be, or they understand the risks themselves based on the metrics that they're seeing.
That's interesting because I don't know, maybe I've just been talking to so many people of late, but one of the things that's come out of this is the board, people are not, exactly what you say is the challenge, but one of the big pieces of feedback I've had is that the board needs to be educated that this is an ongoing thing. It is not done. And the danger that they've seen with advisory around compliance is it's a binary kind of item. You either pass or you fail that gate. And
yes.
To your point then, going back to our school card, there's always school report, and thus our scorecard. There are all sorts of elements within our whole environment, aren't there? That some will be ugly, some will be superb, and everything in between.
Yes, so, correct.
How do we do this? How do we do this? Because boards have over the last few years become saturated with the Sunday newspapers scaring them and seeing so many anecdotal stories. Back to our stories right at the beginning here.
Yep.
And then they've gone through Sarbanes-Oxley, they've gone through PCI, they've gone through XYZ. GDPR was a big flush. We're seeing now data protection in India, which affects so many US firms and firms even in Singapore because of the mobility of workforce and force and the sheer amount of talent that comes from there. That's now spreading and becoming more structured. How do we deal with this? Back to the board point, they're educated in pass and fails or heat maps. How do we show them about the longevity of this journey?
we have to change. It's a very how do I put it? There's a word I'm looking for here. There's a very bullish word. It's pretty much a bullish opinion anyway. But the board of organizations today, their approach to cybersecurity 10 years ago is not what it is today. A lot of board members are very well versed in cybersecurity now, right? It's a journey that they've had to go on over the last number of years. It's a journey, and that journey is never ending. It's continuous learning. And that's one of the jobs that the CISO needs to help with, to help the board members on this continual learning journey, because things are always going to change. On one side of the fence, you've got all of these regulatory requirements to do with either GDPR, or you've got Singapore's PDPA and all of these things. And you mentioned the fact that, you know, in one part of the organization, they may be doing great, in another part of the organization, but they may not be doing so great. But what does that mean overall for the organization? There needs to be a harmonized picture of what this actually means. Somebody's got to put the stake in the ground and say, despite X, Y, and Z, right, that's not so good. In these areas, we are fantastically great. Considering that these things over here are our primary revenue drivers and we have no issues with them, for this period of time, we are fine based on the information I have to hand. But you have to put you have to, you know, put a stake in the ground, because you need to provide assurance that you are confident in what has been done and where things are.
Driven by empirical, but you're giving a sort of very judgmental view, if you like, judgmental in positive sense.
Yes.
Hey, just to quickly throw in before we wrap up some very interesting complexity. This came up about 3 weeks ago. Someone said, we had everything right. We had all the above that you have just described, Trey. And then we made an acquisition and it spoiled everything, because they brought in all of their legacy. And so we're seeing so many wrap-ups in this environment right now as well, which is, you know, we've got everything just fine. The board is all appraised, and then we've brought something in that's ill-defined maybe, and they didn't build on the same stack. We don't have those skills. Before we wrap up, just tell me about how do we deal with that one in this whole judgment of where we are in our state right now.
Having been in a position where a similar thing has happened, I think if you do find yourself in a situation where the organization you're working for primarily grows via acquisition, it's important to make sure that as part of the acquisition process, there are adequate funds in place to assess the security of the organization that is being bought, try and remediate as many of the issues in that organization as part of the acquisition process. And when it comes to integration, having the right kinds of patterns in place that enable you slot things in to your organization in a manner that does not put you at an inordinate amount of risk. And when I say patterns, it could be as simple as, how do I do, I'm a cloud-first company, right? My company grows via acquisition. It is more than likely that the companies that I do buy are not going to be cloud-first companies. So do I have a pattern for performing vulnerability management in a data center? What does that look like? Can my existing tooling do that type of thing? How do I do patching in an on-premise environment? It's these types of patterns, and sort of putting these building blocks in place will enable you to be way more flexible. But by far, the most important thing is try to ensure that there is adequate funding available as part of the acquisition process to identify and address security issues in the organization that is being bought. You may or may not be privy to what is going on, right? But this is where you can call on your previous experience. Knowing where we are today in the world, you're either cloud first, you're hybrid, or you're on-prem. It's kind of like nothing in between, right? It doesn't matter if it's SaaS based or PaaS based or whatever. You're either cloud first, you're hybrid, or you're on-prem. If you are the leader of any one of these organizations and your organization is growing by acquisition, best bear in mind that you might be a cloud first company. You're going to be buying a on-prem company. You're an on-prem company, it is likely you're going to be buying a cloud-first company. What infrastructure, what platforms, what tooling do you have in place that will enable you easily integrate and address security issues in these organizations that you're buying?
Superb and very, very wise words. So in our session today, we have looked at cybersecurity effectiveness, wrapping it up here, culture and creativity, ramping of tech debt, security in the mind, not only of the end user, but also in devs. How do we educate them? How do we deal with compliance and make it work for us? How do we deal with acquisitions once we've already got this? And I guess how we deal with a rapidly changing world with great uncertainty and create patterns that help us. It's an absolutely fascinating area. Trey Mujakporue, thank you very, very much indeed for your time. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and
I did as well.
We shall talk again.
Most definitely. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
See you time.
No problem.